In the last days of February 1945, the headquarters of the Japanese Burma Area Army began receiving reports that did not fit the war its commander thought he was fighting. That commander was a general named Hyotaro Kimura. He was in his mid-50s, a former vice minister of war, a man who had spent his career mastering the machinery of a modern army, the fuel and the ammunition and the railways that keep divisions alive. He was, by reputation, careful and exact. An officer who trusted the map and distrusted the rumour, and the reports now reaching him, if they were true, meant that a town called Meiktila, some 80 miles behind his fighting front, the town through which nearly every bullet and every sack of rice for his armies had to pass, was about to be attacked by a force that could not possibly be there. It seemed impossible. Kimura's main strength was locked in battle far to the north, along the great bend of the Irrawaddy, defending the old royal city of Mandalay, exactly as he had planned. The enemy was supposed to be there, breaking himself against the river. Not here, in the soft interior of the whole position, where there was little but supply dumps and hospitals and airfield guards. Yet the sightings kept coming, and they did not agree with the world. As Kimura understood it days before, an observer had counted a long column of vehicles pouring out of the dry hills toward Meiktila. According to more than one account of the campaign, one such report named 200 vehicles when the real figure was 2,000. Somewhere in the sending or the copying, a single zero had dropped off the end of a number, and with it fell the true scale of the danger. A staff officer, faced with the growing pile of sightings, is said to have asked aloud whether there had been some mistake. There had been no mistake. There had been a man on the other side who had thought further ahead than they had. Hold on to that, because it is the key to everything that follows. This is not really a story about a town in the middle of Burma. It is a story about two ways of seeing a war. One of them was orderly, professional, and completely reasonable, and it lost. The other was patient, deceptive, and almost impossibly bold, and it won. What Kimura most needed to understand in those last days of February was the very thing his enemy had spent 2 years making sure he would grasp too late. Not where is the enemy, not how many, but how. How did a whole corps, with tanks, cross the widest river in the theatre and appear at the one place that would kill an entire army if it fell? This is the story of the Meiktila stroke, and of the quiet, heavy-set English general who designed it. A man his own country had once decided to forget. So, to understand why a Japanese general could not believe the report on his desk, you have to understand what he believed instead and why it was intelligent. Kimura had taken command in Burma in the late summer of 1944, at the lowest point in the fortunes of the Japanese army in Asia. The year before, his predecessors had thrown 3 divisions across the mountains into India in a wild gamble to seize the British bases at Imphal and Kohima. That offensive had ended in the worst land defeat in the history of the Japanese army to that time. Tens of thousands of men had died, most of them not from bullets, but from starvation and disease, on the retreat, dragging themselves back through the monsoon mud toward the Chindwin River. Kimura inherited the survivors. He inherited exhausted divisions, ruined supply lines, and a front that could not be held everywhere at once. The scale of that earlier disaster is worth holding in mind, because it shaped everything Kimura did next. In the fighting around Imphal and Kohima and the long retreat that followed, the Japanese 15th Army had suffered more than 50,000 casualties, tens of thousands of them dead, an army effectively annihilated not in a single battle, but in a slow ordeal of hunger, sickness, and exhaustion, strung out across the hills. Whole units had simply ceased to exist. The tracks back toward the Chindwin were lined with the bodies of men who had lain down and not risen again. Slim's soldiers, following up, had pressed the survivors back over that river and closed up to the edge of central Burma. And now the question facing both commanders was the same. How and where would the British try to take the rest of the country back? Kimura, the careful administrator, the man who thought in terms of tonnage and railways, the arithmetic of what could actually be sustained, gave the answer that the arithmetic supported. So he made a cold and sensible decision. He would not fight on the far side of the Irrawaddy, out on the open dry plain of Shwebo, where the British enjoyed everything he lacked. He would not offer battle where enemy tanks and enemy aircraft could roam freely across flat ground. Instead, he would pull his armies back behind the river itself, and let the river do the work that his tired soldiers could not. The Irrawaddy would be his wall. It ran wide and slow and treacherous through the heart of Burma, in places well over a mile across, braided with shifting sandbanks and false channels. Let the British come to it. Let them try to cross that enormous moat in front of dug-in defenders. Let them fling their boats into the current under machine gun fire, and let the crossing fail. And if by some effort the British forced a bridgehead, they would be doing it at the very end of a supply line hundreds of miles long, reaching back over mountains to India, while Kimura's men fought close to their own dumps. Then, as the season turned and the rains came, he would counterattack a weakened, overextended enemy and drive him back into the water. It was, on paper, a fine plan. It was the plan of a professional who understood that his job was no longer to win Burma, but to hold it, to trade space for time, to make the reconquest so slow and so costly that the war might end before the British ever reached Rangoon. And here is the part that matters. Inside its own logic, it was correct. Kimura had read the ground, he had read the odds, he had read his enemy's supply problem better than his enemy. Sometimes read it himself. He concentrated the bulk of his fighting power around Mandalay, the historic prize, the place any conventional attacker would obviously want, the hinge of central Burma. He was defending the door with his strongest lock. The trouble with defending the door is that it assumes the enemy will come through the door. Kimura had built his whole design around a picture of how the British attacked, and that picture had been true for years. British and Indian offensives in Burma had been careful, methodical, tied umbilically to their roads and their railheads. Advancing at the pace of the slowest lorry, they set peace attacks. They massed, they bombarded, they went forward and measured distance, and they stopped to bring up supplies. A commander who understood that rhythm could predict it, could prepare for it, and could bleed it. Kimura understood it perfectly. What he did not allow for, could not quite allow for, and was that on the other side of the hill the enemy had changed. The army facing him was no longer the army that had been chased out of Burma in disgrace 3 years earlier. It had been remade, from the boots up, by one man. And that man was about to do the single thing Kimura's entire strategy had no answer for. 53 years old in the spring of the campaign, thick-set, with a heavy jaw and a slow, deliberate way of speaking, William Slim did not look like the popular idea of a brilliant general. He looked less like a soldier than like the schoolteacher and the clerk he had actually once been, or a decent regimental officer nearing the end of an ordinary career. He was not glamorous. He was not aristocratic. He had none of the theatrical flash of the famous commanders of the European war. He had been born into a family of modest means in Bristol, in the west of England, and raised in Birmingham. He had gone to a good local school, but not a grand one. He had worked as a clerk and as a school teacher before the First War, and he had gotten his first commission, almost by an accident of paperwork, slipping into an officer training unit he was not, strictly speaking, entitled to join. He was, in the language of the old British Army, not quite the right sort. He spent his whole career being underestimated, and he spent his whole career quietly proving the estimate wrong. He had learned his trade the hard way in the mud of Gallipoli, where he was badly wounded, and later in Mesopotamia, where he was wounded again. Between the wars he had joined the Indian Army, taken a Gurkha regiment, and come to know intimately the soldiers who would one day form the core of his command, the men of the Indian subcontinent and the hillmen of Nepal. He wrote adventure stories on the side, under a pen name, to make extra money for his family. He was, in every visible way, an unspectacular professional. And then, in 1942, the roof fell in on British Asia, and unspectacular professionals were suddenly all that stood between disaster and total collapse. When the Japanese overran Burma in that first terrible year, it was Slim who was handed the job of commanding the retreat. Not the advance, the retreat. He took charge of a broken corps and led it on the longest fighting withdrawal in British military history, some 900 miles from central Burma, all the way back to the frontier of India, harried the entire way, short of food, short of medicine, and riddled with malaria, crossing rivers and mountains ahead of an enemy. He brought what was left of his men out. It was a defeat, one of the greatest defeats British arms had ever suffered in the East, and Slim never pretended otherwise. But he had learned something in those months that the men who were merely winning had not learned. He had learned exactly how his enemy fought, and exactly why his own army had lost, and he had begun, even in the middle of catastrophe, to work out what would have to change. What he built afterward has become one of the great stories of military leadership, and it deserved to be told plainly, without decoration. Slim was given a new army, the 14th Army, cobbled together from British, Indian, Gurkha and African troops, and stationed in the forgotten corner of a global war. Everyone knew where the important fighting was. It was in Europe, in the desert, on the beaches of France. Burma was the afterthought, the last in line for aircraft, for tanks, for landing craft, for attention. A journalist gave the men a bitter nickname that stuck, and that they eventually wore with grim pride. They called themselves the Forgotten Army. Slim's genius was to take that neglect and turn it into identity. If nobody was going to help them, they would learn to help themselves. He rebuilt them from the inside. He attacked the thing that had beaten them worse than any Japanese division had, which was fear and its physical partner, disease. He waged a relentless campaign against malaria, insisting that any commander whose unit let its anti-malaria discipline slip would answer for it personally, and he drove the sickness rate down until his men could actually stay in the field. He retrained them for the jungle, instead of teaching them to fear it, until they moved through it as confidently as the enemy did. He hammered home a single hard doctrine that broke the spell the Japanese had cast. In the early days, whenever the Japanese slipped around a British position and set up a roadblock in the rear, the British had panicked and pulled back because they thought of themselves as cut off. Slim taught them to think the opposite. If the enemy is behind you, he told them, then he is the one surrounded, because he is now between you and your friends, and he can be supplied by nobody, while you can be supplied from the air. Stand still, form a box, fight where you are. We will feed you by parachute that idea. Supply from the sky would become the beating engine of everything that followed. Above all, he went out and showed himself to his men, hundreds of thousands of them, speaking to them in the plain, unshowy way that was natural to him, telling them the truth about how hard it would be and why it was worth it. They called him Uncle Bill. It was not a nickname you gave to a man you feared. It was one you gave to a man you trusted. And trust in that theatre, at that moment, was worth more than another 100 tanks. Slim thought harder about why men fight and go on fighting than almost any commander of his age, and he set his conclusions down in plain words. Morale, he believed, stood on 3 foundations, and they had to be built in order. First was the spiritual, by which he did not mean religion, but belief, the sense that the cause was worth the sacrifice and that a man's own part in it mattered. Second was the intellectual, the conviction that the thing was actually possible, that the plan was sound and the tools were adequate and the enemy could be beaten. Third, and only third, came the material, the guns and the food and the aircraft. Most armies, he noted dryly, put the material first and hoped the rest would follow. He reversed it. He told his men over and over that they could beat the Japanese, that the story of the invincible jungle Superman was exactly that, a story, and he set out to prove it in small actions before he asked them to believe it in large ones. He gave them victories they could touch, patrols that came back having won, positions held that the enemy could not retake until the belief hardened into fact. By the time he asked them to cross the Irrawaddy and drive into the enemy's heart, they were an army that expected to win, and that expectation was itself a weapon. Kimura had no means of blunting. Consider for a moment the shape of this. Here was a general, his own high command had doubted, leading an army his own nation had half forgotten, at the far end of the longest and worst supplied front of the entire war, and he had turned it into the instrument that would inflict on the Japanese army one of the greatest land defeats in its entire history. If that story is new to you, that is exactly why it is worth telling. A single tap on the like button pushes this account in front of someone else who never learned it either, and that one small action is how an army that was forgotten in its own time stays a little less forgotten in ours. Now we come to the idea itself, the thing that left Kimura staring at an impossible signal. In late 1944, Slim launched his offensive to retake central Burma, and his original design was straightforward. He expected Kimura to stand and fight on the Shwepo Plain, on the near side of the Irrawaddy, where Slim could bring his superior armour and air power to bear and smash the Japanese in open battle. It was a good plan for the battle Slim expected. Then his forward troops made a discovery that quietly wrecked it. The Japanese were not on the plain. Kimura had already slipped back across the river. There was going to be no great battle on the open ground, because the enemy had refused to fight there. Slim's beautiful plan was aimed at empty air. A lesser commander would have pushed on anyway, straight at Mandalay, straight at the strong point, and fought the bloody frontal river crossing that Kimura was praying for. Slim did something far harder. In the middle of a moving campaign, with his forces already committed and stretched, he tore up his own plan and wrote a new one. This is the moment that separates a competent general from a great one, and it happened not on a battlefield, but in a tent over a map, as an act of pure imagination. Slim looked at where his enemy was strong, around Mandalay, and he asked the question that changes everything. Not how do I break the strong point, but what is the strong point actually resting on? What is it made of? What keeps it alive? The answer was a town he had barely thought about before, Meiktila. It sat well to the south of Mandalay, out of the fighting, and it was the one place that everything depended on. Through Meiktila ran the road and the railway that fed the entire Japanese front in central Burma. Around it clustered the main supply dumps, the ammunition, the fuel, the food. On its outskirts lay the airfields. It was not the head of the Japanese position, it was the heart, the place the blood flowed through. And Slim saw, with sudden and complete clarity, that if he could seize Meiktila while Kimura was busy defending Mandalay, the whole northern position would starve. The strong point would not have to be stormed. It would simply die on the vine, its supplies cut, its escape routes severed, its defenders left holding a fortress with nothing behind it. But seeing the target was the easy part. The hard part was reaching it without Kimura noticing, until it was too late to matter. Meiktila lay far behind the Japanese front. To take it, Slim would have to get an entire corps, with its tanks and guns and lorries, across the Irrawaddy at a point far to the south, well away from Mandalay, and then drive it fast through 80 miles of enemy-held country to fall on the town by surprise. If Kimura learned of that move in time, he could shift his reserves south and crush the crossing against the riverbank. Everything depended on Kimura keeping his eyes fixed north, on Mandalay, while the real blow gathered in the south. Everything depended, in other words, on a lie. So Slim built one, and it was a masterpiece of its own. He split his army into two great fists. His 33rd Corps, under Lieutenant General Montague Stopford, would drive openly and noisily toward Mandalay from the north, exactly as Kimura expected, making every sign of being the main effort, the obvious hammer swinging at the obvious target. Meanwhile, his 4th Corps, under Lieutenant General Frank Messivi, the true striking force with the armour, would vanish. It would peel away in secret, and moved south down a remote, half-mapped valley called the Gangaw, a route so difficult that the Japanese discounted it as impossible for a major force. Radio was the great danger because both sides listened constantly to the other's signals, so Slim had a phantom conjured out of the airwaves. A dummy corps headquarters was set up in the north, broadcasting the radio traffic that 4th Corps would normally generate, chattering away exactly as if the whole corps was still up there marching on Mandalay. To every Japanese eavesdropper, 4th Corps was precisely where Kimura wanted it to be. In truth, it was slipping away to the south, keeping radio silence, hidden in the hills, aimed like a dagger at the undefended heart. This was not luck. This was design. This was a commander using his enemy's own intelligence, his own reasonable expectations as the weapon against him. Kimura believed the British would come at Mandalay because that is what the British always did, and Slim fed that belief until it became a blindfold. Look closely at what that means. The very professionalism of the Japanese defense, its careful concentration on the logical target, was turned into the reason it would fail. Kimura was not fooled because he was foolish. He was fooled because he was consistent, and Slim had learned to predict him. The secret move itself was a feat that deserves its own telling. To get 4th Corps south without being seen, an entire corps of tens of thousands of men, with tanks and artillery and thousands of vehicles, had to travel down the Gangaw Valley, a narrow, primitive, malarial corridor with no proper road at its start. Engineers went ahead and built the road as the army moved along it, throwing tracks across dry riverbeds and cutting a route through country the enemy had dismissed as impassable to a large force. The march was made in stages, under strict concealment, with elaborate care taken to disguise the size of what was moving. A light covering force pushed ahead to clear the way, and to suggest, if anything was spotted at all, a minor probe rather than the main effort of the army. The whole movement covered a great distance and took weeks, and its success depended on thousands of men keeping a secret, simply by doing their work quietly and well. That is the unglamorous truth behind the brilliant stroke. Before Slim could spring his trap, an army of labourers and drivers and sappers had to build the very ground it would be sprung from, in silence, in the heat, with the enemy, a valley away. There was, however, a flaw in the whole conception that had nothing to do with Kimura, and it very nearly wrecked the operation before it could begin. Slim's entire method of war rested on transport aircraft. His forward troops did not haul their supply with them in the old way. They were fed, fueled, and reinforced from the air by squadrons of Dakota transports that flew day after day over the jungle and the dry belt, dropping and landing the thousands of tons that kept a modern army moving. Take those aircraft away, and the plan was not merely weakened, became impossible. And in December 1944, at the worst imaginable moment, a large part of that transport fleet was suddenly removed. The aircraft were American, and a crisis in China, where the Japanese had launched a major offensive, produced orders that a substantial number of them be flown off at once to that other front. Slim learned that squadrons he had counted on were being pulled out from under his campaign with his own offensive already in motion. He argued that the loss of the aircraft would be fatal to his operations, and he was right that it could have been. It took urgent protest at the highest levels to keep enough of the transport force in Burma to carry the plan through. It is a sobering thought that the boldest stroke of the whole war in the East came within a few signals of dying, not from any enemy action, but from a shortage of cargo planes. Slim would spend the rest of the campaign watching the sky as anxiously as he watched the enemy. There is a deeper thing under this story, and it is worth naming because it is the reason a British audience should feel more than the ordinary pride of a battle won. The army that carried out this stroke was not, in the picture most people carry in their heads, a British army at all. It was one of the most extraordinary coalitions ever fielded under one flag. The great majority of Slim's soldiers were from the Indian subcontinent, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, from what is now India and Pakistan. Alongside them fought the Gurkhas of Nepal and British county regiments, and East and West African troops who had crossed an ocean to fight in a jungle they had never seen. Slim commanded them, not as separate contingents to be kept apart, but as one army, and he was trusted across every line of race and religion and language in a way that was rare then and would be remarkable now. When people speak of the finest feat of British generalship in the war against Japan, they are speaking of a victory won overwhelmingly by Indian and Nepalese and African soldiers, led by an Englishman who never let anyone forget that it was they who turned defeat into victory. That is not a footnote. That is the truth of the 14th Army, and it is a truth that deserves to be spoken more often than it is. Perhaps someone in your own family was out there, in the 14th Army, on the airfields, or in the workshops and hospitals and supply lines that made the whole thing possible. If so, put their name and where they served in the comments below. This kind of memory does not keep itself. It is handed down one name at a time by the people who refuse to let it go, and a name written down is a small stone laid on a very large and mostly unvisited memorial. The plan now had to survive contact with the Irrawaddy, and the Irrawaddy nearly killed it. The crossing at the heart of the story did not happen in isolation. To hold Kimura's attention and stretch his defences thin, the 14th Army came at the river in several places at once, over several weeks, so that the enemy could never be certain which crossing was the real one. Far to the north, back in January, the 19th Indian Division had already thrown small bridgeheads over the river at Kaukmyung and Thabay Khin, and had then held them grimly through weeks of ferocious Japanese counterattacks, drawing enemy strength toward the north exactly as Slim wanted. Later, as the decisive moves developed, the British 2nd Division would force its own crossing only a short distance west of Mandalay. Another blow aimed squarely at the place Kimura expected to be attacked. Each of these crossings was real. Each cost real lives. Together they formed a screen of noise and threat in the north, behind which the true thrust, far to the south, could slip across almost unremarked. When people speak of the Meiktila stroke as a single brilliant idea, it is worth remembering that it was carried on the backs of men crossing the same terrible river in other places, some of them precisely in order to be seen and shot at, so that their comrades elsewhere would not be. In the middle of February 1945, the men of the 7th Indian Division came down to the water near a place called Nyawangu, just above the ancient temple city of Pagan, to make the crossing that would open the road to Meiktila. Slim himself called it the longest opposed river crossing attempted in any theatre of the entire war. The river there ran more than 2,000 yards wide, a vast sheet of moving brown water studded with sandbars that appeared and vanished with the current. The boats were worn out and too few. The outboard motors, soaked and old, coughed and died. And on the far bank sat defenders who could sweep the open water with fire. The first attempts were a disaster. Boats stalled in midstream and swung helplessly in the current. Motors failed under the guns. Men of a British battalion, the 2nd South Lancashires, were caught out on the water as their engines quit and were cut down before they could reach either shore. For a few dreadful hours, it looked as though the whole gamble might drown right there, in front of the temples of Pagan, before it had even begun. What saved it was not a miracle, but preparation and grinding persistence. Tanks were brought down to the near bank to fire directly across the river and hammer the far side. The massed artillery came down on the enemy positions. Fresh waves went out, and this time a foothold was gained, then widened, then made firm Indian and Gurkha battalions poured across and pushed the defenders back from the bank. There is a strange and telling detail here. Some of the men defending that stretch of the river were not Japanese at all. They were soldiers of the Indian National Army, Indians who had gone over to the Japanese side to fight against British rule, believing that Japan would deliver their country's freedom. At Pagan, a body of them chose to surrender rather than fight their own countrymen crossing the water, and it was a Sikh battalion of the crossing force that took that surrender. It is a reminder that this campaign was tangled up with the coming end of an empire, and that the men in the boats and the men on the bank sometimes came from the same villages. History is rarely as clean as a battle map makes it look. With the bridgehead secured, the real blow was unleashed, and now speed was everything. The 17th Indian Division, under one of Slim's most trusted commanders, a tough and clever soldier named David Cowan, whom everyone called Punch, had been specially reorganized for exactly this moment. It was fully motorized, mounted on wheels, and it had under its command the Sherman tanks of the 255th Indian Tank Brigade. On the 20th of February, the division burst out of the bridgehead and drove for Meiktila across dry, open, dusty country, moving faster than the Japanese command could think. Within days it had covered more than half the distance. Then came a gift. About 15 miles short of the town lay an airfield at a place called Thabatkon, and the division seized it almost undefended. That airfield changed the arithmetic of the whole operation, because it meant Slim could now fly in more troops and fly in fuel by the ton, straight into the heart of enemy territory, keeping his spearhead fed and moving. A stream of transport aircraft began landing, delivering the last brigade of the division and the fuel the tanks would drink on the final push. The dagger was through the ribs, and it had a lifeline of its own. On the 28th of February, the assault on Meiktila itself began. What followed was not the surprise walkover that the phrase behind enemy lines might suggest. It was 4 days of savage close-range fighting, because whatever else could be said of the Japanese soldier, he did not surrender a position while he could still hold a weapon. But the garrison of Meiktila, several thousand strong, made up of the defenders of the town and its dumps and its airfields, dug in among the buildings and the bunkers and around the 2 lakes that flanked the town, and fought with a ferocity that had to be seen to be believed. Cowan attacked from several directions at once, one brigade setting a roadblock and driving in from the west, another coming straight down the main road from the north, and the tanks with 2 infantry battalions swinging wide to seize the airfields and strike from the southeast. Infantry and armour worked together in tight, deadly cooperation, the Shermans blasting bunkers apart at point-blank range, while Gurkha and Indian and British infantry went in behind them to clear what was left house by house and room by room. Slim flew in to watch part of it, and he left a description of a single small action that captures the whole. He saw 2 platoons of Gurkhas, supported by a single tank, take a strongly held position in a matter of minutes, moving with such practiced matter-of-fact skill that the thing was over almost before it had begun. This was the army he had built, doing at Meiktila what 3 years earlier it could not have done at all. The defenders held to the very end. When the town finally fell, in the first days of March, only a few dozen prisoners were taken from a garrison of thousands. Nearly all the rest were dead. It was a measure of the enemy's discipline and courage, and also of the pitiless nature of the fighting, that a defence could be so complete and so hopeless at the same time. It was in this fighting that ordinary men did things that language struggles to hold. A soldier of a Baluch battalion, a young man named Fazal Din, was leading his section against a nest of bunkers when a Japanese officer ran him through the body with a sword. He pulled the blade out of himself, killed the officer with it, killed several more of the enemy, and only then, having reported what he had seen so that the attack could go on, did he fall. He died of his wounds. He was awarded the highest decoration for valour that his country could give, the Victoria Cross, and he never knew it. In the same days, a young British officer, William Weston, wounded at the mouth of the last bunker in a cleared position, pulled the pin from a grenade and destroyed himself along with the enemy inside, rather than send his own men into the opening to die. He too received the Victoria Cross, and he too did not live to hear of it. These were not isolated legends. Across the crossing and the drive and the battle for the town, 5 men earned that decoration in a matter of weeks. Most of them earned it with their lives. 2 more of those names belong here because the manner of their courage tells you what kind of fighting this was. During the crossings, a junior officer of a frontier force battalion named Prakash Singh, wounded again and again as he fought, went on directing his platoon after his legs had been shattered, propping himself up to keep his men in the fight until he died, the war cry of his own people on his lips. Weeks later, near Meiktila, a lieutenant named Karamjit Singh Judge became, in the words of those who watched him, the very embodiment of the battle, walking calmly ahead of the tanks and directing their fire onto one enemy bunker after another until he had cleared 10 of them, before he was mortally wounded going forward to finish the last. He was in his early 20s. Like Faz al-Din, like William Weston, he was given the Victoria Cross after his death. Read the citations of these men, and a pattern emerges that is almost unbearable. Again and again, the act that earned the highest honour was not a single wild rush, but a sustained, deliberate, clear-eyed refusal to stop, carried on past the point where the body should have failed, so that other men could live and the attack could go forward. Now put yourself back in Kimura's headquarters, reading that impossible signal. This is the moment the whole design had been built to produce. His attention had been fixed north on Mandalay, exactly as Slim intended. His reserves were committed. And now the news reached him that his single most important town, the artery of his entire central front, had been taken by a force that had appeared as if from nowhere, complete with armour, 80 miles behind his line. The disbelief in that headquarters, the instinct that surely someone somewhere had made an error, was the sound of an entire strategy, realizing it had been outthought. Everything Kimura had arranged so carefully now worked against him. His strength at Mandalay was suddenly not a wall, but a trap, a great mass of men fighting hard for a city whose lifeline had just been cut. Somewhere far behind their backs, Kimura reacted the only way he could. He turned to General Masaki Honda, commander of the Japanese 33rd Army, and ordered him to retake Meiktila at once, whatever the cost. And so the operation entered its second and in some ways its most dangerous phase, because taking Meiktila had been hard, but holding it would be harder still. Honda scraped together every formation he could reach, the better part of 3 divisions and a regiment of tanks, and flung them at the town in a furious effort to smash Cowan's men and reopen the road north. But his forces converged on Meiktila from different directions, at different times, arriving worn and disjointed, and for a critical stretch of the fighting, the British did not even realise that these separate attacks had been placed under one man's command. Honda was trying to conduct a coordinated battle with an army that could barely talk to itself. For much of March, Meiktila was besieged. The 17th Indian Division was now the surrounded one, cut off by land, holding a ring of positions around the town while Honda's soldiers pressed in with guns and infantry and repeated night attacks. Here, everything Slim had drilled into his army over 2 years paid its dividend. His men did not panic at being surrounded, because he had taught them long ago that being surrounded was simply a condition to be fought through, not a catastrophe. Cowan refused to sit still and be battered. He turned his defence inside out, sending armoured columns racing out from the town each day to catch the Japanese as they assembled, breaking up their attacks before they could form, so that the fighting swirled around Meiktila in a confused churning ring. One observer compared the layered pattern of it, defenders and attackers wrapped around one another in bands, to a slice of many-coloured ice cream, and the whole force lived by the air. This was the doctrine Slim had preached for 2 years, now proven in the hardest possible test. The transport aircraft that fed Meiktila were run by a joint British and American organisation, a combat cargo force of several hundred Dakotas, that by this stage of the campaign was flying an enormous volume of supply across central Burma every single day. The airfields around the besieged town were fought over savagely, swept by fire, the ground changing hands yard by yard. Yet as long as any strip could be held, even barely, the aircraft kept coming, bringing in ammunition and food, and flying out the wounded who would otherwise have died where they lay. At the height of the siege, an entire fresh infantry brigade, the 9th Indian Brigade, was flown directly into the contested airfields to reinforce the garrison, the transports landing under fire and unloading men into a battle already raging around the runway, and losing remarkably few aircraft in doing it. The Strix themselves were held by the ground gunners of the Royal Air Force Regiment, whose commanding officer was shot dead by a sniper while directing that defence. When at last the landing grounds became too dangerous even for that, and aircraft could no longer safely touch down, the supply did not stop. It simply came down by parachute instead, drifting into the perimeter while the fighting went on beneath it. The Japanese could not cut the lifeline, because the lifeline was in the sky, and the sky belonged to Slim. Honda could surround the town, he could never seal it. Honda's soldiers fought with their customary desperate bravery, and they died in their thousands, thrown against a defence that would not break and could not be starved. The Japanese command structure, chronically short of the radios and signals equipment it needed, could never quite coordinate the separate blows into one decisive punch. Attacks that might have been overwhelming, if delivered together, arrived piecemeal and were beaten piecemeal. By the end of March, Honda had shattered his own army against Meiktila and gained nothing. His forces had suffered thousands of casualties, lost most of their artillery, and destroyed themselves as an effective fighting body. He was given permission to break off. The siege was over and the Japanese had lost. While all this raged in the south, the northern half of Slim's plan had been closing like a jaw. As soon as Meiktila fell, and the Japanese around Mandalay felt their supply lines being severed behind them, their grip on the city began to fail. The 19th Indian Division, commanded by a small fiery Welshman named Thomas Rees, known throughout the army as Pete, had crossed the river and driven on Mandalay from the north. Rees was a character even in an army full of them about 5 feet 5 inches tall, leading from the very front, so conspicuous in the fighting line that his soldiers half worshipped him. Slim, visiting his headquarters during the battle, once found the little general singing Welsh hymns with his hill soldiers from the Khasi country joining in, and admitted he simply stood and watched in admiration. Mandalay did not fall easily either. The old city was dominated by 2 great obstacles. One was Mandalay Hill, a long ridge covered in temples and pagodas, honeycombed with tunnels and bunkers which had to be cleared foot by foot. Gurkha soldiers stormed it in fierce, close fighting, working through the sacred buildings while the enemy fought from chambers dug beneath them. The other obstacle was Fort Dufferin, the vast walled citadel at the city's centre, a rectangle of massive earth-backed ramparts surrounded by a wide moat, the walls so thick that medium artillery and bombing scarcely dented them. The garrison held the fort against everything thrown at it until the collapse of the wider position made their stand pointless. As Meiktila's fall drained the life out of the whole Japanese defence, the defenders of the fort slipped away in the night through the city's drains and sewers, and Mandalay was taken. The royal palace within, an irreplaceable treasure of teak, built by Burma's last kings, had burned in the fighting, one more thing the war consumed that could never be replaced. With Meiktila held, and Mandalay gone, Kimura's position in central Burma did not merely weaken, it fell to pieces. The 2 great fists of the 14th Army, the anvil at Meiktila and the hammer at Mandalay, had met, and between them they had ground the main Japanese armies in Burma into ruin. What had begun as a plan to avoid a costly frontal battle had ended as one of the most complete operational victories of the war, and the road south to Rangoon, the capital and the great prize, now lay open. But it was a long road, some 300 miles of it, and the monsoon was coming. If the rains broke before the army reached the coast, the tracks would turn to soup, the aircraft would be grounded, and the whole advance could bog down within sight of the goal. So Slim drove south in a headlong race against the weather, Cowan's men once more at the point of the spear, fighting through the last Japanese rearguards down the central corridor. To make certain of the city, a second blow was launched from the sea, an amphibious and airborne landing aimed directly at Rangoon from the Bay of Bengal. As it turned out, the Japanese had already begun abandoning the capital, and the seaborne troops came ashore in early May against little resistance, entering a city the enemy was in the act of leaving. The overland spearhead, slowed by the breaking monsoon and the floods around the town of Pegu, did not quite win the race to the streets of Rangoon, and the two forces finally joined hands a little way north of the city in the first week of May. It hardly mattered which arm arrived first. Between them, the drive from the north and the landing from the sea had taken the capital and closed the campaign, and they had done it before the full weight of the rains could trap the army short of the coast. With Rangoon taken, the reconquest of Burma was, in all but the mopping up, complete. The completeness of the reversal can be measured in a single later figure. When the tracked remnants of Kimura's shattered armies tried to break out across the Sitang River that summer, in what proved to be the last major land battle of the entire war, they lost something on the order of 14,000 men against fewer than 100 British dead. An army that 3 years earlier had chased the British the length of Burma now bled to death trying to escape it. It would be easy to end there on the note of triumph and leave the impression that a clever plan made the killing clean. It did not. No plan does. The victory at Meiktila and Mandalay was bought at a price, and honesty requires that the price be named. In the battle for central Burma, the Allied forces lost more than 2,000 men killed and many thousands more wounded, and the Japanese suffered even heavier losses in dead, killed in numbers that far outstripped the handful of prisoners they allowed to be taken because they so rarely surrendered. Behind the clean arrows on the map were men drowned in the Irrawaddy when their boats failed, men burned in tanks, men bled to death in bunkers, men who died of wounds days later in aircraft flying them out over the jungle. The courage was real on both sides, and so was the suffering. And there is a private grief buried in the middle of the greatest professional achievement of the campaign, which says more about the true cost of command than any casualty return. While David Cowan was fighting the battle of his life at Meiktila, holding the surrounded town against everything Honda could throw at it, word reached him that his own son had been killed. Major Michael Cowan was an officer in the 6th Gurkha Rifles, his father's own regiment, and he died of wounds during the advance on Mandalay in that same first week of March. Cowan carried that knowledge through the rest of the battle. He went on directing the defence, making the decisions that kept thousands of other men's sons alive, while his own was gone. Only a few close to him knew. Slim, who had known Cowan as a friend for more than 20 years, wrote of him with a restraint that is more moving than any speech, praising the steadiness of his grip on the battle and saying nothing that would cheapen the man's silence. That is what these victories are actually made of, not arrows on a map. Fathers who keep working while their hearts break. There is also a harder truth to sit with for those who want the whole picture and not just the flattering half. This campaign was fought at the twilight of the British Empire in Asia, and it was shot through with the contradictions of that moment. Many of the men who won this most British of victories were fighting for a country that did not yet govern itself, and some Indians, as we have seen, had taken up arms on the other side in the hope of hastening their nation's freedom. The war in Burma also fell heavily on Burmese civilians, whose towns and fields and holy places became the ground over which two foreign armies fought. To honour the soldiers of the 14th Army as they richly deserve is not to pretend that the world they fought in was simple, or that every hand was clean. It is to hold the courage and the complexity together, which is the only honest way to remember any war. So what is the real answer to the question Kimura was asking that morning in Rangoon? How did it happen? Why could a professional army, defending sensibly on ground of its own choosing, be so completely undone? The answer is not that the Japanese were poor soldiers, because they were not. They fought at Meiktila and Mandalay with a bravery and endurance that appalled and impressed the men who had to overcome them. The answer is not even that they were outnumbered or outsupplied, though in the end they were both. The answer is that they were outthought by a commander who understood that the target is not always the obvious strong point, that the enemy's greatest strength can be turned into his fatal weakness, and that a lie well told is worth a division in the line. Kimura defended the door. Slim went through the wall. The door was set in and took the room behind it, and let the door defend nothing. And the deeper answer, the one that a British audience should carry away and keep, is about the man himself and the army he made. William Slim was passed over, doubted, and handed the worst job in the war, the retreat, the failure, the forgotten front. He did not complain his way to the top, and he did not charm his way there. He learned. He learned from the defeat that others were too proud to study, and he rebuilt an army that others had written off. And he did it by treating hundreds of thousands of men of every colour and creed as soldiers worthy of his trust, and earning theirs in return. When his moment came in the dry heart of Burma in the spring of 1945, he produced a stroke that soldiers and historians have studied ever since as one of the finest pieces of generalship the British ever managed in the whole of the Second World War. His enemy paid him the deepest compliment one commander can pay another. Kimura is said to have called the Meiktila operation the masterstroke of Allied strategy. It is a rare thing for the losing general to hand the trophy across the table himself. He was not alone in that judgment. The historians who have studied the Burma Campaign most closely have reached for their strongest language when they arrive at Meiktila. The scholar who wrote the first full history of the war in Burma treated the Mandalay and Meiktila operation as one of its truly decisive strokes, and thought it had never been given the recognition it deserved. A famous Chindic commander who had fought his own hard war deep in the jungle said the capture of Meiktila bore the mark of genius. A modern head of war studies at the British Army's own staff college placed Slim as an offensive commander in the same company as the great German and American practitioners of mobile warfare. Another eminent writer has described the whole design as one of the classic demonstrations in the history of war of how manoeuvre, rather than sheer weight of numbers, can unhinge an entire enemy plan at a single blow. This is not the routine praise that every victory attracts. It is the considered verdict of people who have spent their working lives comparing one campaign against another and who keep returning to this dusty, half-forgotten battle in the middle of Burma as an example of the thing done very nearly to perfection. The fates of the men in this story ran on very different rails after the guns fell silent. Kimura was tried after the war for the crimes committed under his command and was hanged in Tokyo at the end of 1948. Honda, whose army was destroyed against Meiktila, survived the war and lived out his years in a defeated and rebuilt Japan. Cowan, the man who won the battle while mourning his son, went on serving and then retired to a quieter life. One of those superb professional soldiers whose names the wider public never learns. And Slim, the clerk's son from Bristol, who had been thought not quite the right sort, rose higher than any of the men who had doubted him. He was made a field marshal. He became the professional head of the entire British Army. He ended his career as the Queen's representative in Australia, cheered by the ordinary people of a country far from his own, and he wrote a memoir of the Burma Campaign, so honest and so free of vanity that soldiers still read it to learn how the thing is actually done. He titled it with the plain phrase that summed up everything he and his army had achieved: the turning of defeat into victory. One honest word about how this account has been put together, because these men deserve accuracy far more than they deserve embellishment. No character in this story has been invented, and no one here is a stand-in for somebody else. Every person named was a real person who did the thing described. Where the story takes you inside the confusion of the Japanese command, it is following what the records and the histories actually report: the ignored reconnaissance, the misread column, the disbelief in the headquarters. The drop zero that turned 2,000 vehicles into 200 is set down in more than one history of the campaign, where the exact numbers differ between sources, as casualty counts and precise dates so often do. The aim here has been to stay within what the evidence will support rather than reach for a bigger or rounder figure. The river was crossed where it is said to have been crossed. The town fell across the days described. The plan was as bold as it sounds, and boldness on that scale needs no exaggeration to be worth an hour of your time. The men who broke the Japanese army in Burma came from a dozen nations and 80 years on, they remain too little known in the country, whose flag they fought under. That is the quiet injustice this kind of story exists to correct. If you want more of them, accounts of commanders who were doubted, and armies that were overlooked, and the moments where a clear idea beat brute force, then stay with this channel, because there are many still to tell. And if someone in your family carried the Burma star, say so below, and say their name. The road these men opened was a long one, and it was walked by people who should not be allowed to vanish from the telling of it.